In what we would call late-stage democracies, what democracy as a system of government has given us are men who cannot differentiate between Black people put in a lineup, are people who don't know what they're doing. And we think that at the end of the day, having Trump as a president, Bolsonaro as a president, Boris Johnson as head of parliament is not the kind of leadership that we're looking for. When people fight revolutions, then don't fight necessarily for the right to choose in democracies. They fight for the right to have a better life. They fight for an elite that will actually stand up for them. We think that's better set in technocracies. Three things that I'm going to be talking about. Firstly, why we think that knowledge is incredibly important, incredibly valuable in policymaking and needs to better policy. Second, about why we think that technocracies best fulfill the interests of everyone. Lastly, about corruption, why we think that that's more likely to happen in democracies than in technocracies. Before that, a little bit of contextualization. What do we think technocracies and democracies mean in this debate? Firstly, technocracies. I think that overall, a technocracy means a system of government in which a small number of technical experts, which are picked for their merits and for their knowledge and ability to understand policy, their qualifications, are the ones who run the government. I think that probably the closest that we have to this is, hi Darion, Singapore, but I think that aspects of it are also present in places, for example, like Hong Kong. But more importantly, and here's what we want to emphasize, aspects of technocracy are already present within our democratic systems. If you look at, for example, how people select in governments, the heads of central banks of every country, all of those are awarded not on individuals choosing, but rather because of meritocratic and technocratic means. We think that that's probably the best representation of what technocracies look like, given that we think that most technocracies are unfair when you compare them to democracies, given that in many cases they just came out of revolutions, they're in the very early stages of development as a nation. Democracies overall, we think they're governments elected by the people, either be it by popular vote, as you do in, for example, Mexico, first past the post, as you do in the United Kingdom, or the Electoral College, as you do in the United States. Systems vary, but always it is the people choose. On to my first argument then. Why do we think that knowledge makes for better policy? And I really think that we're starting from quite an uncontroversial premise on this argument, and that's the idea that policy is better when the individuals who are making that policy and deciding when that policy gets implemented know what they're doing and know what that policy does. I think that overall, there's three issues that we can point to in democracies that we think that technocracy fixes. Firstly, taking issues seriously because you know that those issues are problems, rather than because the population has convinced you that they are, rather than because the population is either convinced that they aren't, or because you are behest to corporate interests, such as, for example, big pharma or big oil, that tell you that those interests matter less than the amount of corporate funding that they can put into your next campaign. We think that those issues have been ignored for years. Things such as climate change, for example, which is not in the interest of the vast majority of big oil companies, when they have to lose the vast majority of their funding. And I think that overall that is better fixed when you have experts that know that something is a problem and that know that it has to be addressed. Second thing that we think knowledge fixes, and I think that overall is that a lack of understanding of the complex consequences of actions that you're taking oftentimes happens with politicians. And I think that happens because when you apply policy, it is not just a, oh, well, I guess this happens because I'm playing some sort of Sims-like video game, but rather the consequences that you take vary widely depending on the number of people, on the policy that you're crafting, on how long it is applied, on how it is applied across across a really widespread of socioeconomic spectrum. And I think that overall, that means that you're better able to understand that policy when you actually are an expert in that area. It is not sufficient that government politicians get briefed on the day by an actual expert for them to be able to understand the consequences of the actions that they take. We think that therefore, policy is better taken by experts. The last thing that I want to point out is that we think that overall, democracies don't necessarily result in good policy. And I think that the main problem is the means of selecting politicians necessarily mean that they're not going to necessarily be able to take those decisions. Firstly, we think it is because career politicians are oftentimes the one who gets selected. In order to even be nominated for a presidential position, you have to either have like a lot of money, like some people do, but alternatively, you have to have been in the system for a very long time. You have to know the people who are at the top of the line, which means that you're not necessarily the person best suited for the job, but rather the person that those at the top know that is best suited for the job. And I think that means that then you're not an expert in a particular area, you're just an expert in politicking, which is not what you want for a policymaker. But I think secondly, is that also people get it the wrong way every time. People who don't believe in climate change, who don't think that vaccines, who who think that vaccines give you autism. No, thank you. And I think that overall, it means that it doesn't result in that. The opposition can stand up here and tell you that that's why governments have civil service and advisors. But if at the end of the day, the politician that they elect is just going to do what the advisors tell them, we say, just put the advisors in power. That probably results in much better policy making. They can't have their cake and eat it as well. Overall, knowledge results in better policy. That's what Connor and I are standing for. Second argument, why do we think that it's also better for the interests of all? And we think that democracies are remarkably bad at this. But before I go on to that, Darion.
Who gets to select technocrats and how?
I mean, that's quite a complex question, right? And I think that overall, it just, we don't necessarily think that we have a current system of technocracy that we can stand for and represent for the reasons that I said earlier. But second, I think that overall, it is just individuals who are running the government probably get to select who are the experts in that area. We envision that they put themselves forward and are selected by an independent committee of experts. So yeah, that's more or less what we think. Overall, why do we think that the interests of all are best represented in technocracies? And I think that, again, democracies are remarkably bad at this for three reasons. Firstly, because elections don't represent everyone. In the United States, you have a massive disparity in income and in racial votes in terms of who gets to select the next president of the United States. In literally every country on earth, most of the people who vote are very middle class and often extremely rich. And I think that that means that that is skewed. It means that then the individuals who get to decide who is elected are those people, but also that politicians cater with their policies specifically to those people. It means that a lot of individuals are left behind. That's why socioeconomic disparities are massive across the world. Second is that we also think that the selection method is biased. It breeds bipartisanship. It is bad that when a liberal person is elected, the conservatives don't have anyone who represents them because they can't talk to someone who's across the aisle because that's betraying their party. We think that experts are able to see past those lines and just do what is better for everyone. And I think that also, and this is the main thing, is that there is no long-term interest that's at stake because politicians, by definition in democracies, only care about what happens after the next election cycle, 5 years, 4 years, 6 years. They don't see about the long term. They don't know what happens. Lastly, corruption. Did not have time for this, but that's fine because we didn't prep an argument for Connor, so he can give this one. But overall, we think that technocracies breed better politicians, and we think that's more important. Please vote proposition.
We see that technocracy fundamentally undermines the agency of individuals to choose and influence the material conditions of their existence. This is going to be the principal point we will claim in this debate. We're also going to have some practical stuff as well because it's fun. All rebuttal will be integrated. Let's start with the most essential principle in this debate. And this is, we say, the recourse towards the state. Let's analyze the relationship between the state and the individual. We say that the state has disproportionate power over the individual person and controls every facet of their life. One, the state implements legislation. So this means that your healthcare, your social welfare, and your wages are determined by laws that are outside of your control. Two, the state either explicitly uses coercion or the threat of coercion should be disobeyed. So it has mechanisms like the police and the military, which it can deploy against you, and you actually have no way of resisting. But thirdly, and most importantly, you cannot opt out of being in a state. Given that the entire world is made up of states, you can migrate between them, but you can never escape the yoke of the state. This therefore means that the entirety of your life, and therefore the happiness you will achieve within it, is dependent on the state. The corollary of this is therefore that in order to control your destiny, you need to be able to control the state. Why is this important? Because we say it is a very important segment of having a dignified life. Because to be able to control state policy means to be able to have control over the conditions under which you will achieve happiness. It's to control the opportunities you have and how the structure of opportunities interacts with you. So we say that even if their policy is going to work perfectly, we still stand against it on principle, because we say it is principally illegitimate to completely vest the destiny of an individual, therefore everything they have in the material world, on a mere uncertainty, on a mere prayer for luck that the technocrat is going to make a good decision. We say this removes the control of individuals' lives from their hands, therefore divests them of their dignity. But we also have a couple of rebuttals here. Lucia tells you, look, we do not see why a democracy is going to represent everyone. First of all, we say she implicitly concedes the principle by claiming that this is a bad thing, because therefore the implication of this is that it's good to have more representation. Therefore, the burden on government is to show why you have more representation in technocracy, right? Note that democratic mechanisms are created in such a way that even though obviously the government is in power and has the largest amount of policy tools at their disposal, the opposition has factual and material ways in which to fight for the interests of those of the opposition represents. Two, it's very often enough for a minority party to get 2 or 3 seats in parliament in order to be a kingmaker in whether or not the government is going to be created. It's very often enough to have those 2 or 3 votes to be able to trade them for policies. I will vote with you on this if you vote with me on another thing. But we also say that in a democracy, specifically because of the electoral interest, you can have grassroots movements, right? Take a look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders in the United States of America. The AOC is not a presidential candidate. Bernie lost the primaries, but it still influenced the overall currents within the Democratic Party because the electoral incentives have sent a signaling effect to the party that they have to change the principles in which they act. Otherwise, they will lose a lot of the electorate that is supposed to win the presidential election. They have learned from the electoral signals because they know that Hillary lost to Trump because Bernie voters were also dissatisfied with her policies. So the mechanisms are there to achieve representation. Also, a couple of more smaller points of rebuttal. We say, yeah, Lucia, we will say that people do have advisors in government cabinets. That's probably a fair mitigation. We will also say that governments also tend to negotiate trade deals, regardless of whether they're popularly elected. This means that a lot of the lobbying incentives are probably still there. But thirdly, the argument on Trump and Bolsonaro is just an argument for more democracy, right? The reason why Trump and Bolsonaro can fuck everything up with the COVID-19 pandemic is because they can factually run the country through executive orders without enough check by the parliament. So unless you prove to us why you for some reason assume that every technocrat you select is going to be absolutely perfect, have good intentions, and align with your moral compass, we say the same possibility can happen in technocracy. At that point, we probably need more control. I would be very happy to see a referendum on Donald Trump at this specific point in time. Maybe something would change at that point. But also 2 principal responses here. One, we said even if the conviction of the population is wrong as per opening government, we do not say that opening government has any other morally more significant claim to truth in terms of policy. So given that every individual is best placed to determine the conditions in their life and how these conditions and their desires align with policy preferences, even if this is objectively wrong, the government does not have access to a repository of knowledge that is better. The government also does not have access to epistemological truth about what a good policy is in the first place. Therefore, we should have the best placed actor decide. The best placed actor is the individual citizen. But let's take into account another point of principle here. They cannot assume on their side that technocrats will always make perfect decisions. Very often they will fuck up completely. Take a look at the European Union and how the technocrats and the troika fucking up austerity policy has led to huge protests, revolutions, and economies crumbling. Like, for example, in Greece, the examples Lucia herself mentions, like Singapore and Hong Kong, I'm sorry, Darion, are not exactly paragons of good governance. What does this mean? This means that at the point where a change is necessary, given there is no democratic method of change, the only way for that change to occur is through protesting, through riots, through revolution. Why is that problematic? One, on the principle. We say it's principally illegitimate for you to have individuals risk their own lives in order to be able to regain control of their lives. We say that you essentially force individuals to perhaps forfeit all of the happiness they have in this world through dying or losing their job just to be able to regain control over their happiness. That's illegitimate. Before I move on with that, I'm willing to take a POI from Conrad and Lucia.
All right, so it's all good and well if a minority party becomes a kingpin or if AOC's brand of politics becomes influential, but that still means that most of the population's views are not being represented. By your own logic, is that government then not illegitimate? And isn't it better when we represent quality of life rather than some ambiguous idea about representation?
We can increase representation by allowing for more democratic mechanisms. We can have direct local governance, like in Porto Alegre in Brazil, or in the Basque County. There are different mechanisms to implement this, but 2, you have never proven why on the comparative technocrats will truly represent the quality of life of all people. So that point is moot. We also say it's principally illegitimate to force people to cause damage to themselves, damage to others, and damage to the entire economy through infrastructure that is potentially going to be ravaged during protests like those we saw in Greece or in Chile, in Santiago, when the people perceive they have no other control over their government. This means, therefore, that you not only force people to damage themselves, but you also force them to damage the assets that they will later use in reconstructing their life. We see that to the extent to which the government can never claim with 100% certainty that technocrats will be perfect, this is an unfair thing to do. Lastly, Lucia's answer to Darion's POI means that there's probably an electoral incentive for technocrats as well, so it have to be selected amongst the pool of technocrats. So these incentives are something that Darion is going to talk more about. He's also going to talk about how electoral incentives and being bent to the will of the people is something that leads to more productive and better decisions. For all of those reasons, vote open opposition.
Lucia gives you many reasons to suggest that technocrats are the only individuals that can understand and properly respond to the kinds of wicked policy issues that most contemporary politicians face. Now, the only response we get to this cogent and incredibly important argumentation is to say, well, there are advisors and other technocrats that can be filtered through the mechanism of a politician to administer policy. The problem here is twofold. The first is that obviously that means that politicians have to appeal to the lowest common denominator, being the voter, which means regardless of whether you convince the politician on an individual level of the fact that these problems exist and you should solve them in a particular way, you're never able to politically justify and implement them at the point at which people don't believe them. But secondly, and importantly, it recognizes the fundamental tension that is in the opposition case, and it is as simple as this. They do not recognize that politicians are not representing the entire electorate to speak, but rather the individuals that elected them at a particular point in time. And that really defeats a huge amount of their principled argumentation, insofar as the vast majority of people live in a society where they have not actually elected, whether it be their council person or their state representative or their national representative, because governments are majoritarian when they're democratic, and that was the key problem that we diagnosed at government. The governmental majoritarianism leads to worse outcomes for all and defeats a lot of their material. So firstly, I'm going to rebut some of their material regarding the principle, and then I'm going to deal with practical argumentation, then adding two pieces of substantive, firstly regarding why we are less likely to have tyranny in a system of technocracy, and secondly on corruption. So essentially, side opposition argue that the state has disproportionate power in a variety of ways, and therefore it is principally illegitimate to invest that in an uncertain manner and allow for a technocrat to act on their own whims, and that's something we can't control. The first and really obvious point is that no one really consents to that decision. There is very little social contractarian analysis given at all by side opposition to justify this, which is to say that many individuals do not consent to all policies, do not consent to the specific policies represented, and often actively do not consent to those policies by voting for a different political party and by virtue of a variety of arbitrary factors, whether it be gerrymandering. I want to say gerrymandering because it initially was Governor Gary that was the first person to do it, not Governor Jerry. So I'm just going to get that one in there as a plug. But also the other forms of first past the post voting or preferential voting or the particular idiosyncrasies of that voting system, which means you don't actually get that representation equated. But secondly, obviously the most democratic systems, unless you're talking about pure, Athenian style democracy, are vested through a politician who themselves has to interpret the particular signals that are given in voting, which means a lot of the material again falls because it is decided by the whims of these individuals and it is not representative. And that's actually a really important distinction I'm about to get into later, because they say, well, we conceded it's important to have representation. No, what we explained is that it is an unachievable goal, firstly, but secondly, structurally, technocrats are better able to consider the kinds of problems of representation, because the problem isn't understanding, people want like food on the table and good healthcare and good education. It's a problem of understanding how to deliver those public goods. And side opposition do very little work to explain the fact that this is actually quite a simple calculus, because they go for a very, Darion-esque argument. I've seen it before, Darion. I like the argument, but I don't think it's true in this context, which is that no one can understand the truth of policy and harm. So the individual is best placed to actually do this. So as I've explained previously, the individual isn't the one doing it in the vast majority of democracies. It is through the intervening factor of that politician. But secondly, it's actually incredibly obvious in the vast majority of cases where technocracies exist, whether we're talking about assessing the cost of goods and services and assessing the kind of things we actually need to deal with. And the question's actually the how, not the what we should be doing in the first place, because a lot of the government's roles are actually prescribed quite clearly. The final kind of flippant piece of analysis given is to say, well, it's illegitimate to forfeit your life to try to regain power, which is essentially just a practical argument that being dead is bad if you're fighting for your own freedom. And we explain that we are better at stopping people from dying for their freedom because we better allow them to eat and be treated at quality healthcare facilities, which doesn't happen on side opposition when you have Bolsonaro in power. That's a bit flippant, but sorry, I'll give more argumentation on that in my second question of the outcomes. Now, we get a mechanistic quibble from side opposition when they say, well, how do you actually elect people in these systems? And the answer is, well, as Lucia very eloquently outlined, we do it under the status quo by outlining a set of criteria. So for instance, at the RBA or at these technocratic institutions, you're chosen as Chief Justice because you have an excellent judicial record. You have an excellent record of education, you have an excellent record of achievement, and all of your assessments are based on those metrics. It is of benefiting the population and the public in a key and important way. And that's fundamentally why we actually get over their problem of representation, because we say that often in technocratic systems, there's a culture of trying to achieve the best outcomes based on a variety of indicators. So the best education, the best healthcare, etc. Which is why I had a very pleasant time in that particular situation in Singapore, for instance, because there were wonderful hospitals and wonderful healthcare facilities, educational facilities, because that is what politicians are structurally incentivized to do, because they will be sacked not based on the public's whim, but based on not meeting their KPIs. And that is the fundamental distinction between a technocracy and a democracy, and it's something that opposition doesn't engage with. What do they say in response? They say, well, grassroots movements and systems can influence you in some way, which Lucia destroys quite devastatingly in her POI response by POI by saying that, well, it's a pretty convenient scenario, and I don't think it's even true. Like, Bernie obviously didn't get elected. And the final thing they say is, well, there are advisors, but I've already dealt with that in my introduction. They're very, very unuseful in that context. I'll take a POI if you have one, otherwise I'll move on to some argumentation. Brilliant. So, two arguments. First, why they're less prone to tyranny. Tyranny is obviously pretty awful insofar as we're talking about the worst forms of authoritarian crackdowns and suffering as created by dictatorships that deprive you of your fundamental human rights, which is kind of the worst case scenario that opposition was referring to. Why technocracy is less likely to move towards those sort of outcomes? Quite simple. The way in which promotion and recruitment systems work are outcomes focused, which is to say, who gets appointed, how they get appointed, and how they get promoted is very much based on their record of achievement and their record of success. And that's something you can't really rig. You can't, buy their way through this in the same way that you can with popular appeal, because it's clear, it's on paper, it's really difficult to falsify. And the second thing is that even if that's not true, people who do manage to worm their way through but do a bad job at it are always removed. But the alternative is majoritarianism and democracies, where we say that often if you're a minority and you have a really strong interest in having your rights turned against, but the majority thinks there's a small benefit to be extracted from that. For instance, things like environmental racism, for instance, that means that people put power plants in African American communities because it benefits marginally white communities but massively harms black communities. That's the kind of harm that happens. With regards to corruption, two additional reasons why corruption is less likely. Firstly, there are fewer people to influence insofar as you have fewer nodes of influence, because technocracies are more centralized based on the decision-making apparatus of what is considered to be technocratic or not. And secondly, it's just much easier in democracies to pay people off for their vote rather than to pay them off to get a quality education and receive all these different KPI indicator results and et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, we think technocracies are far superior at achieving the kind of outcomes our public policy systems strive for, and that is why we are proud to propose. Thank you.
The central claim of the opening government case is that technocracies are better at implementing socially utile policies than democracies. Here's two ways in which we're going to broadly respond to this claim. Firstly, by establishing that socially utile policy is less important than the consent of the governed. Second, by establishing that the premise is false. In general, technocracies are not better at policy making. I'm going to establish this in my extension about productive incentives. What that means is we're going to first prove that the metric that we've provided for this debate, consent, is the more important metric. And we're going to also beat opening government on the metric they've supplied. So on both possible counts, we're going to be winning this debate. Before I get into any of that, just like to make two remarks about the government case as a sort of general framing and motivation. Note here that they've played two tricks on us. The first trick is, so OG says Trump is bad, anti-vaxxers are bad, voter suppression in the US is really bad. I'd like to point out that a lot of the motivation for this gov case is drawn from one example of one arguably very dysfunctional democracy. That is actually an argument for our side, because we would argue that the US does not actually embody the values that we think a democracy should. That is an argument for more democracy, not less democracy. The second trick they've played on us on OG is that they spend a lot of time proving that that technocrats have the relevant abilities to implement policy, but never proving that they have the relevant incentives to do so. Noting that a very competent person with very bad incentives is going to do a lot of damage. So merely proving competence is insufficient, and arguably in many cases is a bad thing if they have misaligned incentives. So with those 2 points in mind, let us first begin with why socially utile policy is less important than the consent of the governed. Liberal egalitarianism begins with the tension between two facts. People are fundamentally free and equal, yet we live in states where some are subject to the power of others. This produces a burden on states to justify their right to exercise that power. If someone came up to me and demanded that I regularly pay them money and follow a set of rules they prescribed, on pain of experiencing severe violence, I would expect them to offer some kind of justification. And that is the problem which Tin identifies, which is that the only plausible justification for why it's acceptable for someone to do this to me, to exercise so much power, is if I consent to that power being exercised upon me. How does opening government respond to this? So they have two broad lines of response here. The first, this is really key. Note that this is where the entirety of the OGA engagement comes from. They claim in both speeches that not everyone consents to the state under democracy because of differential turnout, and because even if you turn out, your party doesn't necessarily win. Okay, note one, that their proof of the sort of suppressed voter turnout is largely US-centric. Beyond that, here are four responses to this claim. Number one, not every country is the US. There are lots of countries without like widespread schemes of voter suppression. Two, that is an argument for more democracy, because voter suppression, i.e. not letting lots of people vote, means your state is less democratic. We are supporting democracy, which has less voter suppression. Three, assuming for the sake of argument that there is low voter suppression, but still low voter turnout, which is true in many countries, we do think people have the right not to turn out and vote in an election. That is also something which is covered under the broad principle umbrella of letting people consent to the state. That is, you also have a right to not vote in an election. Fourthly, note here that this is just uncomparative as an argument. Even if there is no perfect consent, i.e. not everyone consents to the state, and even if like you vote for a party, but the party doesn't win, there is still comparatively more ability to consent than under a technocracy. That is what matters here. Note that even if your party loses, you always have the potential for that party to win in the future. That is the distinction between democracy and technocracy. The second line of response, this is a bit smaller, it's sort of framing in Lucia's speech. She says this is just like central banks. It's just like any other meritocratic profession where you outsource decision-making to someone more competent. The difference here is in the scale of the power involved here. The state is not like any other meritocratic profession because it exercises a total monopoly over its right to use violence. It also establishes a framework under which all other professions operate. So even if you say that central banks carry lots of influence over people's lives, so why don't people get a consent? Note here that the ability to control who is in power in the state has an influence on how central banks operate, because the state dictates the framework in which all the other institutions play out. So for these reasons, I don't think OG actually engages meaningfully with the argument about consent. Ultimately, just comparatively, there is more consent, even if it's imperfect, on our side than theirs. Here as well, I want to weigh this principle against the OG principle to explain why this is more important. For the sake of argument, let's assume that you have better quality of life and more social utility under a technocracy. We do not think that is intrinsically valuable. Why is utility or why is anything in the world valuable? We contest that the only reason that anything in the world has value is that the human will wills it. There's a couple of ways you can see why that's true. The first way is to notice that things like pleasure and pain are clearly not intrinsically valuable. Some people opt to experience pain, like people who step into a boxing ring, and some people opt to not experience pleasure, like people who choose to become ascetic monks, for example. Clearly, what makes those things valuable or not is not anything intrinsic about pleasure and pain, but it's whether people consent to it, whether they will that those things are valuable to them. The second way you could see this is to note, this is a more a more abstract way, but this also matters in debates sometimes. Note that if you believe that these things have intrinsic value, you'd have to believe that value was something plastered to the world around you, as a property of things in the world. But that would make them both metaphysically a bit strange, unlike anything else in the world, and that would require you to believe that we had some special sense faculty that was capable of just noticing this mysterious thing called value. It's more plausible to think that value comes from an act of will. If I think something is valuable and I will that it has value, then it has value. Ergo, consent is more important than things like utility. Even if there is more utility on prop side, there is more consent, imperfect as it may be on our side. That's why our principle beats theirs. I now want to extend and talk about the second thing, which is why productive incentives mean that you're actually more likely to get good policy making on our side. Note here, you have very bad incentives as a technocrat. The assertion from this opening government is that you have good incentives because if you don't meet some KPIs that someone establishes, you get fired. The question that they never answered was, who sets those KPIs and how? I suspect that KPIs are probably produced by whatever internal apparatus of the technocratic party that is ruling a country operates. That means that whoever is most senior in the party or a committee of people from this party presumably decide what counts as a good technocrat, and they decide who gets to be appointed as a successor and so on. That is a problem because the people who constitute technocratic parties are almost always people who come from the governing elite. They are always people who are wealthy, always people who are more educated, always people from particular walks of life. And that means that the sorts of people who ascend the ranks in a technocracy are people who pander to those interests exclusively. That is a harm. Note also that in addition to the fact that you have to pander to bad selectorates, you're also habituated out of interacting with people. Because when you are part of a technocratic political party that is encouraged to believe that you are superior to everyone else and that you know better, it discourages you from listening to what people on the ground really want. Fundamentally, Either technocrats act in accordance with the general will, in which case we think you should just do democracy, or they do not, in which case they are not justified. Very happy to stand in opposition.